Edmund Voss did not knock. He walked into the attorney's office like a man who had never once in his life been told to wait, dropped a leather satchel onto the desk, and spread out 3 documents before the clerk had even looked up from his ledger. "File all 3 today," Edmund said. "I want her declared incompetent by Friday." The clerk blinked. "Sir, the woman you're describing, she's 6 months along." "I know exactly what she is." Edmund straightened his cuffs. "She is my property that wandered off, and I intend to collect her." He was not angry. That was the thing that made the clerk's skin crawl. Edmund Voss said all of it with the flat, unhurried certainty of a man moving cattle from one pen to another. His wife was not a person to him. She was an escaped asset, and he wanted her back before she cost him any more embarrassment. If you've never heard the name Lenora Ashcombe, you're about to. And once you do, you won't forget her. This channel tells the stories of women who were left with nothing and built everything anyway. If that's the kind of story that keeps you up at night, in the best possible way, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell so you never miss one. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from, because I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. Now, settle in. This one's going to take a while, and every single minute of it is worth it. The land office in Cheyenne smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, and the man behind the counter had the particular brand of bored contempt reserved for people he had already decided were wasting his time. Lenora Ashcombe walked in on a Tuesday in October, set her leather satchel on the counter, and folded the document toward him without a word. He glanced at it. Then he looked at her, at the obvious swell of her stomach beneath her wool coat, at the chapped skin on her hands, at the single carpet bag sitting beside her feet, and he let out a slow breath through his nose. "Ma'am," he said, "not unkindly, this parcel you're looking at is 40 acres in the Red Willow Basin. There's a reason nobody's claimed it." "What reason?" "Creek floods in spring. Ground's rocky past the first 10 yards. Nearest neighbor's 5 miles south, and the nearest town, if you want to call Red Willow Crossing a town, is 8 miles northeast." He tapped the document. "It's been sitting unclaimed for 4 years. That means the price is low," Lenora said. "It means there's a reason you told me that part." She met his eyes. "What's the price?" He told her. She counted out the money onto the counter in paper and coin, every dollar of what remained of her grandmother's inheritance, and she did not look down while she did it. She kept her eyes on his face, because she had learned in 7 years of marriage to Edmund Voss that the moment you looked down was the moment a man decided he had won something. The clerk counted it twice. Then he stamped the document and slid it back to her. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" he asked. "I will by morning," she said, and picked up her bag. She had figured the wagon problem wrong. That was the first real mistake. And she made it 6 miles outside of Cheyenne, when the hired driver she'd paid to haul her timber dropped her load at the edge of a frozen mud road and told her the axle on his rig couldn't handle the last 2 miles to the claim. "I'll refund you half," he said, already unhitching the team. "You'll refund me nothing," Lenora said, "because you are going to stay here while I figure this out." He stared at her. "Lady, I got 3 other jobs, and you'll get to them after." She stood in the road with her hands on her hips and looked at the pile of cut timber, at the frozen ground, at the 2 miles of rutted track stretching toward a flat horizon. "Do you have rope?" Yes, but..." "Good, start cutting lengths." She did not have a plan yet. She made one while her hands moved. She'd seen a logging crew once, years before Edmund, on a trip east with her father, and she'd watched them move timber over frozen ground, using nothing but rope and leverage and sheer bloody-mindedness. She'd been 14 and fascinated. Edmund had pulled her away from the window of the carriage and told her it was not appropriate to stare at working men. She thought about that now, and she pulled a length of timber herself, and she did not stare at anything except the next 10 feet of road. It took 4 hours. By the time she reached the claim, her back was screaming, her hands were raw, and the driver had stopped complaining and started actually helping, not out of chivalry, she suspected, but because he'd gotten curious somewhere around hour 2. "You done this before?" he asked, coiling the last of the rope. "No," she said. He looked at the pile of timber, at her, at the land. "You got a plan for the cabin?" "I have a drawing." "Can I see it?" She showed him. He studied it for a long time, scratching the side of his jaw. "This cross brace here, you're going to want it lower. Ground shifts in spring, you need the weight distributements. Here?" she pointed. Yeah, right there." She pulled out her pencil and changed the drawing. He left without asking for his full refund. She wasn't sure if that was sympathy or just forgetting. Either way, she needed every cent. The first night she slept under a canvas shelter weighted with rocks, and the wind came in from the north and pulled one corner loose, and she woke up at 2 a.m. to cold air on her face and had to re-anchor it in the dark, with her fingers so stiff she could barely make a fist. She lay back down and looked at the stars through the gap and thought, I have been cold before. Edmund kept the bedroom windows open in January because he said warm rooms made a person weak. She had shivered in her own bed in a house with 6 fireplaces. This was different. This cold was hers. She fell asleep again before she could decide if that was a good thing. Red Willow Crossing had 211 people, one dry goods store, a livery, a doctor who doubled as the barber, and the particular social architecture of any small place where everyone knew everyone's business and considered that knowledge a form of property. Lenora walked in for the first time on a Thursday, 8 days after her arrival, to buy lamp oil and flour. She had mud on her boots and a fresh cut on her left forearm from a saw that had slipped, and she had wrapped it with a strip torn from her hem because she hadn't wanted to stop. The dry goods store went quiet when she walked in. Not completely quiet. People kept talking. But the talking changed register became a little too careful, a little too pointed away, and Lenora had grown up in a small place herself, and she knew exactly what that meant. The owner, a round-faced man named Pettifer, smiled at her, with the smile men use when they feel sorry for someone and don't want to admit it. Heard you took the Ridley parcel, he said, wrapping her flour. That old creek land, that's right. By yourself. By myself. He glanced at her stomach, not for long. But she saw it. You need anything, he said carefully. My wife does some nursing. I need lamp oil, Lenora said. A half gallon. And if you carry harness leather, I could use about 3 feet. He found both. While he was wrapping the leather, a woman in a green dress standing near the window said to the woman beside her, not quietly enough, She'll be back in town by Christmas. You'll see. Before the snow hits hard. Lenora paid, picked up her parcels, and walked to the door. Then she stopped. She turned around. Mrs., she said to the woman in green. The woman straightened. Colleen Marsh, Mrs. Marsh. I'll tell you what. If I come back to town before Christmas for any reason other than supplies, you can have the satisfaction of saying so. She paused. But if I'm still out there come spring, I'd appreciate you telling people it's because I built something worth staying in. She left before anyone could answer. Outside, the wind hit her face and she let it, because her cheeks were hot, and she didn't want anyone through the window to see that. The walls went up slower than she'd planned. Her drawing had been good enough that the timber driver's cross brace note had been the only real correction. But a drawing doesn't account for the weight of wet wood. For the way a notched log refuses to seat properly and has to be repositioned 3 times before it sits true. For the way pregnancy shifts your center of gravity at the worst possible moments when you're trying to lift something that requires your whole body. She adapted. She built a rough wedge system from scrap timber to hold pieces in place while she worked the joints. She'd read about it somewhere, or maybe half read it. In one of the books, Edmund had eventually stopped letting her borrow from the library because he said she was filling her head with useless things. His voice lived in her head still. That was the part she hadn't accounted for, not the physical difficulty. She'd known the physical difficulty would be brutal. She'd prepared for brutal. What she hadn't prepared for was lying on her back, under the half-built wall at sunset, too tired to lift her arms, listening to his voice in her head telling her she was not capable of this, had never been capable of anything, that the best outcome she could hope for was to embarrass herself quickly enough to be found before she did real damage to herself or the child. She lay there for a while. Then she got up and ate the last of her cold cornbread and went back to work by lantern light until her hands stopped shaking. The baby moved for the first time, the first real movement, not the flutters she'd been dismissing as hunger, on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks into construction, when she was sitting on an overturned bucket trimming a door frame. She went completely still. It happened again. A slow roll like a fish turning in deep water. She sat there with her hand flat against her stomach and her eyes on the half-built wall in front of her, and she did not cry. She had made a decision early on not to cry over good things, because good things were hard enough to hold on to without getting them wet. All right, she said out loud, to no one. I hear you. She picked up her saw and went back to work. She met Garrick Hale on a Thursday evening when the temperature had dropped 20 degrees since noon, and she was up on the roof, or what would eventually be the roof, currently about 2/3 of a roof with a gap she was trying to close before the next front moved in. She heard the horse before she saw it, a big gray, moving quiet on the frozen ground, stopping at the edge of her claim line with a man on its back who looked like he'd been riding since morning. He didn't say anything immediately. He sat his horse and looked at the structure, at her, at the timber pile, at the work she'd done. She kept working. She had learned that the best way to handle men who stopped to look was to give them nothing to say. He dismounted, tied the gray to a fence post. She'd put in 4 fence posts because she needed something to tie things to, which was as far as she'd gotten with a fence. He walked to the base of the cabin and looked up at her. "You've got a gap," he said. "I know. Storm's coming. Tonight, probably." "I know that too." She repositioned a board. "There anything I can help you with?" "I'm Garrick Hale." She knew the name. Everybody in a 50-mile radius knew the Hale name. They ran cattle from here to the Sweetwater, had the only reliable well access on the eastern slope, and Bram Hale, the patriarch. The uncle was precisely the kind of man who knew exactly what power he had and was comfortable making sure other people knew it too. "I know who you are," she said. She didn't stop working. "Your family owns the land to the south and east. I don't think my 40 acres concerns the Hale Ranch much." "It concerns the creek," he said. There it was. She'd been wondering when someone would get to it. Her land had the only creek access on the north side of the basin, and she'd known when she bought it that access was the reason the price was low, because whoever bought it could restrict water flow to the larger properties if they chose to, and the larger properties knew it and didn't want to deal with someone they couldn't control. "You've come to buy me out," she said. "Not a question. I've come to see the property," he said. "Same thing from where I'm standing." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the second hammer from where it was sitting on the timber pile, and without asking, without explaining, he climbed up the other side of the roof and started closing the gap from that end. She stopped. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't. I don't want it offered because you feel sorry for me." He fit a board into place and held it. "I don't feel sorry for you. You've got more than half a roof on, and the walls are properly notched. That's more than most men I know would have managed by now." He looked at her across the gap. "I'm helping because the storm's coming, and we'll both be here faster if we work from both sides." She looked at him for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. "Don't move that center beam," she said. "It's load-bearing." "I can see that," he said. They worked until the gap was closed. Then they worked until the whole section was tight. The temperature was dropping hard by then, and her fingers were clumsy, and she made 2 mistakes she had to correct, and he didn't say anything about either of them, just waited while she fixed them. When it was done, she climbed down, and so did he. "You'll need chinking on the north wall before it gets colder," he said. "I know. I'll do it," she said. Then, because she wasn't her worst self even on her worst days, "Thank you." For the roof, he nodded, untied his horse, mounted. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. She looked up. "My uncle sent me out here to look at the property," he said. "I'm telling you that plainly. He wants the creek access, and he's going to want me to report back on whether you're worth negotiating with or whether he should find another way." She held his gaze. "What are you going to tell him?" Garrick looked at the cabin, at the work she'd done, at the lamp burning inside through the gap that would be a window once she had glass. "I'm going to tell him you're worth negotiating with," he said. "I'd recommend being ready for that conversation." He rode south into the dark. She stood in the cold for a moment, listening to the hoofbeats fade. Then she went inside and ate her supper and wrote 6 pages of notes. In the ledger she was keeping dimensions, materials, costs, dates, everything, because even then, before she knew she'd need it, some part of her understood that the only real protection a woman without allies had was a paper record that could speak for her when no one else would. Bram Hale arrived at her claim on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, which was not how negotiations were supposed to work. You were supposed to meet on neutral ground, at the land office, or the lawyer's office, or at minimum in town. But Bram Hale had spent 60 years conducting business on his terms, and he wasn't about to change that for a pregnant woman on 40 acres. He rode up with 2 men and a look on his face, like he was visiting a problem that was about to be solved. Lenora came to the cabin door with her ledger under one arm, because she'd been working on her records when she heard the horses. "Mrs. Voss," Bram said, and she noticed immediately that he'd used her married name, which she had not. "Miss Ashcombe," she said. "Or Mrs. Ashcombe, my grandmother's name." What can I do for you, Mr. Hale? He looked her over in the way powerful men look at inconveniences, assessing what it will cost to remove them. I'll come to the point. Your 40 acres isn't much to you. To us, the creek access is significant. I'm prepared to offer you enough to set you up comfortable somewhere real, somewhere with a community, before the baby comes. Before the baby comes, she repeated. Miss Ashcombe. He adjusted his tone slightly toward something approaching patience. I admire what you've done out here. I do. It's remarkable for your situation. But this is not a permanent solution. You have to know that. Why? He blinked. Why is this not a permanent solution, she said. Because I'm a woman? Because I'm pregnant? Because the winters are hard? Give me a specific reason, Mr. Hale, because I've been out here 6 weeks and I'm still here, and the cabin I'm standing in front of is still standing, and the water in my creek is still running. One of his men shifted in his saddle. The other one looked at the ground. Bram's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He had not expected her to argue. Men like Bram rarely got argued with. They made an offer, and people took it, or they found another way to arrange things. The offer stands, he said. Think on it. I've thought on it, she said. No, thank you. He looked at her one more moment. Then he wheeled his horse and rode out without another word. She went back inside and sat down, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her pencil. She wrote the date, the time, what had been said, and what had been offered, and she added Bram Hale's name to the ledger. In the back section she'd titled, simply People. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in December, 3 days before the first real blizzard of the season. She recognized Edmund's handwriting on the envelope before she even opened it. She'd been married to the man for 7 years. She knew his handwriting the way she knew the sound of his footsteps on a wooden floor, the particular quality of attention she had to pay when she heard them. She set the letter on the table and looked at it for a while. Then she opened it. It was short. Edmund did not waste words when he wanted to be menacing. That was one of the things she had learned about him. The shorter the letter, the worse the news. He had found her. He did not say how. He was coming west in the spring. He had retained legal counsel in Cheyenne. He intended to establish before the territorial court that she was unfit to manage her own affairs and unfit to raise a child without proper supervision. He had 4 witnesses prepared to testify to her instability. He wanted her to understand clearly that she could make this easy, or she could make it hard, and that either way she was coming home. She read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in the ledger. She sat for a long time in the quiet of the cabin, listening to the wind pick up outside, watching the flame of the lantern bend and recover. Instability. She had pulled 2 miles of timber across frozen ground on her hands. She had notched every log in these walls with tools she'd taught herself to use from a manual she'd bought for 30 cents at a second-hand shop in Cheyenne. She had been building a home in winter while 6 months pregnant, and she had not asked one person for a single thing she didn't absolutely need. She picked up her pencil. She opened the ledger to a fresh page, and she began making a list. Garrick came back on a Thursday, not on Hale Ranch business this time. He came with a half-pound of nails she hadn't known she needed, and that he'd apparently noticed were running low from across the yard on his last visit, and she wasn't sure whether to be grateful or unsettled by that level of attention. You need a door brace, he said, looking at the current setup, which was functional but not elegant. Wind gets under that bottom edge. I know. I'm getting to it. He looked at her face. Something happened. I got a letter. From my husband. The word sat in the room for a moment. She'd never said it out loud to him. She watched him absorb it. He knows where I am, she said. He's coming in spring. He's going to try to have me declared incompetent. Garrick was quiet for a moment. What kind of man does that? The kind who doesn't like his property walking away from him, she said, and the bitterness in her voice surprised even her. He set down the nails. What are you going to do? Keep building, she said. Document everything. If I can prove this is a real homestead, a functioning one, with crops planned and water access and a structure that'll last, it changes what he can argue. She paused. I need witnesses. People who can say what they've seen. He met her eyes. I can do that. Your family won't like it. No, he said. They won't. Garrick. She said his name carefully, because she didn't use it often and she wanted him to hear that she meant it. I'm not asking you to ruin yourself for my sake. I'm telling you what I need so you understand the situation. I understand the situation, he said. He picked up the nails and looked around the cabin. You got a brace kit? Or should I cut one? She stared at him for a moment. Cuts are in the pile out back, she said, second stack. He nodded and went outside. She stood in the middle of her cabin and looked at the walls she'd built, at the records on the table, at the door that needed a brace. Then she went back to her list. The blizzard came in on a Saturday night and lasted 3 days. She had known it was coming. The air had that particular heaviness, the specific silence before serious weather, and she had spent the 48 hours before it in a blur of preparation that left her so tired she fell asleep, sitting up at the table on Friday evening, and didn't wake until the beep. Snow was already sheeting sideways against the window. She had enough food, enough wood. She had tested every seal on the walls and stuffed clay and hemp into every gap she could find. She had a system for the snow. When it reached a certain depth on the roof, she'd go up and clear it, which was a terrible idea for a woman in her 7th month of pregnancy, but also the only idea available since a roof collapse was worse. On the second day, she didn't go out at all. She sat by the fire and mended her coat and thought about Edmund's letter. She had built something here. She had built it with her hands, in winter with no help except the akosur Garrick had given, and even those hours she had directed. The cabin stood. The walls were sound. The roof she'd finished just in time was holding. If Edmund wanted to call that instability, he was going to have to say it, while she stood in the room she'd built and showed him everything that proved him wrong. On the third day, the snow stopped. She dug out the door, checked the roof, found it sound, and walked the perimeter of her 40 acres in the cold, bright silence of a world that had been scraped clean. The creek was frozen but not dead. She could see the current moving underneath the ice. She stood there for a while, watching it. In spring, she thought it would run again. Her land, her water, her record, let him come. The thaw came in stages, the way it always did in Wyoming, not a clean break from winter, but a slow negotiation. A few warm days followed by a hard freeze. Then warmth again, the land making up its mind in fits and starts. Lenora noticed the creek first. It had been running under the ice for weeks, but on a Tuesday morning in late February, she heard it before she saw it, a low, insistent murmur beneath the crust, like something that had been patient long enough, and was done waiting. By afternoon, the ice at the edges had pulled back, and the water was running free in a narrow channel down the center, cold and clear, and moving with more force than she'd expected from such a modest stream. She stood at the bank for a long time, just watching it. She had 40 acres, a standing cabin, and a creek that ran year-round. She had a ledger with 112 pages of documented work, costs, measurements, and dates. She had 3 months of Wyoming winter behind her, and she was still here. Edmund's letter sat in the back of the ledger, folded into thirds, next to the section she'd titled People. She hadn't read it again. She didn't need to. She'd read it enough times that first night that it had burned itself into a part of her brain she could access without trying, and she'd made her peace with that. A threat you've memorized can't surprise you. What it could do was move you, and she'd let it do exactly that. It had moved her hands faster, moved her pencil across more pages, moved her boots across more frozen ground at more ungodly hours than was probably wise for a woman in her 7th month of pregnancy. Her midwife back in Ohio, the one woman she'd trusted enough to tell anything real to, had told her that fear and stubbornness together made a particular kind of fuel. Lenora had thought that was wisdom at the time. Standing at the creek in February, she thought it might just be true. She heard a horse and turned. Garrick Hale came across the south field at an easy walk, his gray picking through the last patches of crusted snow. He'd been coming by with some regularity since January, not every day, not even every week, but enough that she'd stopped being surprised by it. He always had a reason, a length of rope, a bag of grain. Once, inexplicably, a window frame with the glass already fitted, which he'd set against the outside wall of the cabin, and said was from a structure on the Hale property that was being torn down, and did she want it? She'd said yes before he finished the sentence. "Creek's running," he said, pulling up beside her. "Since this morning." He studied the water the way men who grew up around land study things they know can become problems. You'll want to bank up the east side before the real melt. There's a low spot about 30 yards up that floods out if you don't divert it right. "I found it last week," she said. "I've been stacking rock." He glanced at her, then at the row of flat stones she'd been hauling from the far end of the property. His expression didn't change exactly, but something in it acknowledged that she'd gotten there before he arrived to tell her about it, and she caught that acknowledgement and held on to it, the way she held on to every small thing that proved she was managing. Bram asked about you again, he said. Asked what? Whether you'd reconsidered selling. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was still watching the creek. I told him no. You shouldn't answer for me. I know what you told him, Garrick said. I told him what you told him. That's not answering for you, that's just repeating. He finally looked at her. He's going to come back himself. He doesn't like being told no by somebody he's decided doesn't have standing to say it. By a woman. Yes, she appreciated that he didn't soften it. She'd grown up around men who softened things, and had spent 7 years married to a man who sharpened them, and she'd decided somewhere along the way that direct was better than either. Let him come, she said. I'll tell him the same thing. Garrick nodded. He stepped down from his horse, and without making it a thing, he walked up the bank to where she'd been stacking rock and picked up a flat stone and set it in place. She watched him for a moment and then picked up the next one herself. They worked like that for a while, not talking, which was something she'd gotten used to with him. He was not a man who filled silence because he was uncomfortable with it, and she'd known enough men who did that to recognize the difference. It meant his words, when he used them, were actually attached to something. They came from somewhere. They went somewhere. He's going to hear about Edmund's letter eventually, she said. Garrick set a stone. Has that changed your timeline? I'm doing everything I planned to do anyway. Planting as soon as the ground softens enough. Documenting the crop plan and the seed purchase. I need someone at the land office to certify that the improvements are real and current. I've been making my own records, but a second source matters. She paused. I could use a name. Ellis Croft, he said without hesitating. He's the land agent in Red Willow. Fair man. He'll do a site inspection for a small fee, and he'll document what he sees honestly. I can arrange an introduction if you want. I can introduce myself. I know you can. I'm offering to make it faster. She picked up the next stone. All right. Yes. Thank you. He handed her one. She couldn't have reached easily from where she was standing, and she took it without comment, and they finished the row in the last light of the afternoon. The first time Lenora went to the Red Willow crossing dry goods and didn't feel the temperature of the room change when she walked in. She almost didn't notice it. She was focused on her list hinges. She needed hinges for the new interior door and hemp cord, and she'd been debating for 2 weeks whether she could justify the cost of a small hand saw with a better grip than her current one, because her current one was starting to bind on cuts, and that was a problem waiting to happen. She was halfway through her list when she realized Pettifer's wife, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Ruth, had been talking to her for 3 minutes, as if they knew each other. And my cousin's husband tried the same cross-brace method you were describing to Chester last month, and it held all winter. Didn't shift an inch, Ruth was saying. She was wrapping the hemp cord with the quick efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. He's been doing it wrong for years, is the thing. Too high on the wall. It should sit at 1/3 of the total wall height, Lenora said. Any higher, and you're bracing the wrong point. That's exactly what Chester said after he talked to you. Ruth pushed the wrapped cord across the counter. You have time this Saturday? My neighbor Vera's husband put up a storage shed in the fall, and it's leaning bad. I told her she should come ask you to look at it before it gets worse. Lenora blinked. I'm not a builder. You built your own cabin at 7 months pregnant, Ruth said, in the tone of a woman who had seen the cabin and was not interested in false modesty. You know more than anybody who's built one around here, including most of the men. She left with her hinges, her cord, and the good saw, which she justified on the grounds that a binding saw was a safety problem. And safety problems were not the time to economize. She also left with a Saturday appointment to look at Vera's storage shed, which she hadn't agreed to exactly, but also hadn't refused. And she wasn't sure what that meant, except that somewhere between October and February, the woman Red Willow Crossing had been so certain would leave, had become someone its residents were starting to ask things of. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She wasn't sure she had time to feel things about it. She wrote it in her ledger that night and moved on. The gossip started in March, which was earlier than she'd expected and uglier than she'd prepared for, though she wasn't sure you could really prepare for a particular kind of ugly. She heard it secondhand from Ruth Pettifer, who had the kind of directness Lenora had come to rely on precisely because Ruth didn't wrap things. There's talk, Ruth said, catching her outside the store on a Wednesday, about you and Garrick Hale. Lenora kept her expression level. What kind of talk? The kind that says you're out there alone because you planned it, that you got rid of one man to get your hooks into a better one. Ruth's mouth was tight, It's nonsense, but it's spreading. Who's spreading it? Ruth hesitated just long enough. Colleen Marsh started it, but it didn't stay with her. Lenora thought of Colleen Marsh in her green dress in December and the comment about being back in town by Christmas. She'd almost forgotten about that. Almost. What exactly are people saying? That Garrick's been out at your place regular since fall. That your husband probably found out about it, and that's the real reason you left. That the whole homestead story is theater.
To get sympathy.
Ruth stopped. I'm sorry to be the one telling you. Don't be, Lenora said. I'd rather know. She meant it. Ignorance had cost her before, in a different way, in a life she'd left behind. She was not going to let it cost her again. She drove home slowly, thinking. The gossip was a problem for several reasons, the least of which was her own reputation, and the most of which was Edmund's lawyers. If there was already a narrative circulating that called her morality into question, Edmund's attorney wouldn't have to build it from scratch. He'd just collect the pieces that were already lying around Red Willow Crossing and hand them to a judge. She needed to think. She was still thinking when she came over the low rise before her property and found Garrick's gray tied at her fence, and Garrick himself sitting on an overturned crate outside her door, with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has something unpleasant to say. She pulled up beside him. You heard. My uncle heard, he said. Which is worse. She tied the wagon horse and sat down on the step. What did Bram say, he said. Garrick stopped. He turned his hat over once in his hands. He said I'm making myself look like a fool over a woman who's using me, and that if I don't stop coming out here, he's going to start making decisions about the ranch that I won't like. What kind of decisions? The kind that involve my name not being on anything. She looked at him steadily. Then stop coming out here. That's not, I mean it. Her voice was even, not angry, not hurt, just clear. Garrick, I am not going to be the reason you lose your inheritance. That is not something I'm willing to carry. It's my choice. Yes, and I'm asking you to make a different one. She held his gaze. I have a plan. I have a good plan. I can do what I need to do without witnesses who've paid a price to be here. If you lose your standing with your family, and it turns out the judge sides with Edmund anyway, then you've given up everything for nothing. Don't do that. He was quiet for a long time. The wind moved across the field. A raven landed on the fence post nearest the creek and sat there being self-important. I'm not going to stop coming, Garrick said finally. Garrick, I'm not. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was too plain-spoken to be romantic and too persistent to be ignored. I've been thinking about what I'm doing out here, and it's not about the creek anymore, and it's not about my uncle. And I'd like to be honest with you about that, because I think you prefer honest. She waited. I come because I want to, he said. And I think you might understand that better than you're letting on. But I'm not saying it to put pressure on you. I'm saying it so you know the reason I'm staying isn't pity or calculation. She looked at her hands. The calluses had layered over the original blisters, which had layered over the soft skin she'd had in October, and her hands looked nothing like what they used to. They looked like what they were now. I understand, she said. Okay? I still think you should be careful. I can be careful and still show up, he said. Those aren't the same thing. She didn't have an answer for that, so she didn't give one. The land agent Ellis Croft arrived on a Friday morning in March with a notebook and a pair of reading spectacles and the mildly preoccupied air of a man who had a lot of land to look at and preferred to do it in his own time without interruption. Lenora gave him the ledger. He looked at it, really looked, the way she'd hoped someone would, turning pages with 2 fingers, pausing at the construction records, pausing longer at the water source documentation, making small sounds in his throat that could have meant anything. You've got photographs, he said, looking at the small stack she'd had made at the photography studio in Cheyenne during her last supply run, a luxury she'd justified as evidence. 7. Taken at different stages of construction. Dated on the back. He turned one over, looked at the date. Turned it back, and looked at the cabin in the image, rough-walled and 3/4 complete, with a clear early winter sky behind it. And this is your own work, he said. The building. Yes. The plans were mine. I have the original drawing and every revision. He looked over his spectacles at her. Miss Ashcombe, I've been doing site inspections for 12 years. I've seen homestead claims put together in a week to satisfy the minimum legal requirement, and I've seen claims that were genuine. He tapped the ledger. This is unusual. Unusual how? Thorough, he said. More thorough than most, and more thorough than the law requires. He closed it. That's not accidental. No, she said. It's not. He walked every square foot of the property. He measured the cabin length, width, wall height, roof pitch. He inspected the creek bank, the stacked stone diversion she'd built, the first cleared section of field she'd broken with a borrowed plow. He wrote for a long time in his notebook at the fence line, looking out at the 40 acres with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. When he came back, she had tea made, which she hadn't planned on, but it had seemed like the right thing to do. He accepted it without comment and sat at her table. I'll certify the improvements, he said. What I've seen here constitutes a functioning homestead. The documentation is consistent with the physical evidence, which is the part that matters legally. He folded his notebook. May I ask a question? Yes. Level of documentation is this in anticipation of a specific legal challenge? She kept her face steady. My husband intends to petition the territorial court to have me declared incompetent and the homestead voided. Croft looked at her for a moment. He didn't react visibly, which she appreciated. When spring, he said. He has legal counsel in Cheyenne. And witnesses, presumably. 4, he said. Croft put his notebook in his coat pocket and wrapped both hands around his tea. I've seen that maneuver, he said. Husband uses incompetency petition to recover property a wife has legally claimed. It's not common, but it happens. He paused. Does he have legitimate witnesses or? He has money, Lenora said. Croft nodded slowly. You'll want counsel of your own. I know. I'm working on that. She paused. Your certification matters. It's a third party on record before any petition is filed. It establishes the timeline. He looked at her the way Ellis Croft apparently looked at people when they'd surprised him into something close to respect. Yes, he said, it does. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and it was not from Edmund. It was from her friend Clara Hess, who'd been her closest friend since before the marriage, and who had been writing to a postbox in Red Willow since October, with news that Lenora read and filed and thought about at night when there was nothing else to do with her hands. This telegram was not the usual letter. It was 8 words. He knows about the hearing date. Stop, he's moving faster. Stop. Lenora read it 3 times in the post office doorway, with the spring wind pulling at her coat, and then she walked to her wagon and sat in it for a moment. Edmund had a hearing date, which meant he'd already filed, which meant she was behind by whatever time had passed between the filing and this telegram. She drove to the land office. Then she drove to the one attorney in Red Willow who'd agreed to take her case for deferred payment, a cautious man named Delbert Foss, who was better than his office suggested, and whose deferred payment arrangement she'd proposed herself, because she'd had exactly enough money for the land and the cabin and the seed, and attorney fees were not something she could conjure from careful planning alone. Foss read the telegram twice. He's petitioned early. Yes. Do you have a hearing date? Not yet. But if he's filed, I'll be served. When were you planning to tell me about this? I'm telling you now. He gave her a look over the top of the telegram that was not quite reproachful, but was in that neighborhood. Miss Ashcombe, if I'm your counsel, I need to know things when they happen, not. I found out 20 minutes ago, she said. I'm here. He had the grace to acknowledge that. He set the telegram on his desk and pulled out a pad. All right, tell me everything. She told him everything. She had it organized, she always had it organized, and she went through it in sequence: Edmund's letter, the claim documentation, Ellis Croft's site inspection, the ledger, the photographs, Garrick's offer to testify. She laid it out in about 20 minutes and then waited while Foss wrote. The Hale boy, Foss said, not looking up. Garrick. Yes. He'll testify? He's offered. His uncle know? She paused. Not yet. Foss looked up. His uncle finds out before the hearing. That's a problem. Bram Hale has influence with every judge within 2 counties. He tapped his pen on the pad. Garrick's testimony is valuable precisely because he's a Hale. But if Bram moves against it before the hearing, it turns into a liability instead. I know. So we need to control the timing of when Bram finds out. Garrick will handle that conversation, she said. Has he agreed to? He'll agree. Foss studied her. You're very certain of that. She thought of Garrick sitting on the overturned crate outside her door with his hat in his hands. Yes, she said. She told Garrick that evening. He'd come by on his own, some instinct, she thought, or maybe just timing, and she was on the south side of the cabin remortaring a section of wall that had developed a crack over the winter, and she heard his horse and kept working until he came around the corner and stopped beside her. Edmund filed, she said. There's a hearing. My lawyer says we need to control when Bram finds out about your testimony. Garrick was quiet, meaning she continued, working the mortar with a flat knife, that if Bram knows too early, he has time to apply pressure. To judges, to witnesses, to you. He can't stop me from testifying. He can make it more complicated. She smoothed the mortar and moved down the wall. Delbert Foss wants to know if you'll agree to tell your uncle only when he directs you to. So we control the timing. Garrick watched her work. What happens to you if I don't testify? I have Croft's certification. I have the ledger. I have the photographs. She kept her eyes on the wall. I have a reasonable case without you. That's not what I asked. She stopped, turned to look at him. I don't know. Edmund is well-funded and well-connected, and he's had 7 years to learn exactly how to make a case against me. Your testimony a Hale, independent of me, describing what he witnessed firsthand, it changes the weight of it. She paused. Without it, I might still win. The ledger is solid. But it's harder. He nodded once. Tell Foss I'll do it his way. Whenever he says. She looked at him for a moment. You understand what this might cost you? Yes. Bram will. I know what Bram will do, Garrick said quietly. I've known Bram my whole life. I know exactly what he'll do. He met her eyes. It doesn't change what's right. She held his gaze for a moment and then turned back to the wall, because the mortar was beginning to set and she needed to work it now or lose the section, and because there were things happening in her chest that she didn't have words for, and she'd learned not to trust the things she couldn't name. Thank you, she said to the wall. Don't thank me yet, he said. Wait until it's over. Bram Hale came to her property alone, which surprised her. She'd expected him to bring men. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when the fields were soft with the first real warmth of the season, and he stood at her fence and waited, which surprised her more. Bram Hale did not, in her experience, wait. She went to the fence. I know about the hearing, he said, and I know what Garrick's planning to do. She'd known this was coming. She'd told herself she was ready. She found that ready and prepared were two different things. Then you know I haven't asked him to do anything he didn't offer. He's 22 years old. He's 36, she said. He's older than me. Bram's jaw tightened. He doesn't understand what he's risking. He does, she said. I've told him exactly what he's risking. He's made his own decision. Because of you. Because of what he thinks is right, she said. Those aren't the same thing. Bram put one hand on the fence rail. He was a big man, wide through the chest, and when he leaned on a fence, it took on a different quality. It became a different kind of thing. She noticed it, and she did not step back, because she had learned in a long, grinding marriage that the moment you stepped back was the moment the man in front of you learned what would move you. I'm going to tell you this plain, Bram said. Whatever happens at that hearing, my family's interests are my business. Garrick is my business. You pulled him into something that doesn't concern him. He walked onto my property of his own accord, she said, in October, when I didn't ask anyone for anything. He picked up the hammer and helped me close my roof before a storm. That's what happened. And then he kept coming back, not because I needed him to, but because he chose to. She looked at Bram steadily. I don't know what kind of woman you've decided I am, Mr. Hale, but I am not the kind who manufactures men. What Garrick is doing is his own. Bram looked at her for a long time. The creek ran in the background. A horse in the east field tossed its head. My nephew is going to lose things over this, Bram said, and for the first time there was something in it that wasn't entirely aggression. I know, she said. I've tried to stop him. He won't be stopped. She held his gaze. If that's the kind of man he is, I think you raised him. She wasn't sure why she said that last part. She wasn't sure it was smart. But it was true, and she'd stopped filtering for what was smart at the expense of what was true somewhere around month 4 in a Wyoming winter. Bram's expression shifted slightly, in a direction she couldn't read. He pushed back from the fence. The hearing's in May, he said, as if she didn't know. Yes, you'd better be ready. I will be, she said. He rode out without looking back. She stood at the fence until she couldn't hear him anymore, and then she walked to the creek and sat on the bank, and let herself shake for about 3 minutes, which was all she was going to allow, because there was still a day's worth of work to finish, and the ground wasn't going to break itself. The gossip got worse through April. She'd expected it to Edmund's petition had been served at the end of March, which meant it was formally part of the public record, which meant Red Willow Crossing had something solid to talk about. The incompetency petition, the estranged wealthy husband from the East, the baby coming in a month, The Hale nephew who'd been seen at her property a dozen times over the winter. She heard it in pieces. A comment at Pettifer's store that went quiet when she walked in. A cluster of women outside the milliner's that parted slightly when she passed. A note slipped under her wagon seat unsigned, 2 lines that she read once and then burned, because it was the kind of thing that was only useful for making you feel worse, and she couldn't afford worse right now. What she hadn't expected was the other thing that was also happening. Underneath the gossip, quieter and less dramatic, was a different current. Vera's husband had asked her to look at the storage shed in March, and she'd showed him what was wrong and how to fix it, and the shed had stopped leaning. He'd told someone, who'd told someone, and now 3 other homesteaders had come by the claim with questions about soil drainage, about roof framing, about how she'd managed her water access through the winter. She answered every one of them because they were real questions, and she knew the answers, and there was no reason not to. She wasn't sure, yet, what that meant. She was 3 days from her hearing date when it happened. She was coming back from Foss's office in town, where they'd spent 2 hours going through the witness questions, when she saw Edmund. She knew it was him before she saw his face. The posture first that particular held quality, back straight, shoulders squared, the body of a man who'd spent his whole life making rooms smaller just by walking into them. He was standing outside the hotel in Red Willow with a man in a dark coat who was obviously the Cheyenne attorney, and a third man she didn't recognize, and they were looking at something in a folder. He saw her at the same moment. She was on the wagon seat with her reins in her hands and nowhere to go that didn't look like retreat. So she held the horse steady, and she looked at him, and she did not look away. Edmund handed the folder to his attorney. He walked toward her with his hands in his coat pockets, and that particular easiness of movement that had taken her a long time to understand was not actually ease, it was control. Complete, practiced, invisible control. Lenora, he said. Not Mrs. Voss. Not Miss Ashcombe. Just her name, in the tone of someone picking up an item they'd set down briefly. Edmund, she said. He looked at her stomach. You look well. I am. He made a brief gesture that encompassed, apparently, the wagon and the town and the entire situation. Is this everything you hoped it would be? She felt the words forming and let them sit for a moment before she said them. It's mine, she said. That's more than I hoped for. His eyes were flat. That had always been the tell, not anger, not contempt, just this particular flatness when something wasn't going the way he wanted. You're going to lose on Friday, he said. Maybe. There's no maybe. I know what you have, she said. I know how many witnesses and how much legal preparation and how much money. I know all of it. She held the reins steady. The horse shifted. She held him. You forgot one thing, Edmund waited. You forgot that I've been keeping records since the day I got there, she said. Everything. Every nail, every cost, every measurement, every date. And there's a man who sat across from me for 2 hours and certified every word of it. Edmund smiled. It didn't reach the flat part of his eyes. A ledger, he said. You think a judge is going to look at a ledger kept by a pregnant woman with no formal education in land law and decide against a man with 4 witnesses and 20 years of business dealings in this territory? I think this particular judge might, she said. She took up the reins properly, because this particular ledger has photographs. She drove past him before he could answer, and she kept her hands completely steady until she was 3 blocks away, and then she had to pull over and press her palms flat against her thighs and breathe for a moment, because her heart was going at a rate that was not helpful for a woman 8.5 months along. But she had done it. She'd looked at him, and she hadn't looked away, and she hadn't reached for anything he was offering. She drove home. She ate supper. She opened the ledger to the last page she'd written on, and she started preparing her notes for Friday. She didn't sleep the night before the hearing. She'd known she wouldn't, so she hadn't tried. She'd lain in the narrow bed she'd built from leftover timber. The frame wasn't level on one side. A flaw she'd noticed immediately and corrected twice, and still wasn't entirely satisfied with. And she'd stared at the ceiling. She'd put up herself and gone through everything in order. The ledger, the photographs, Croft's certification, Foss's line of questioning, the points Edmund's attorney would try to make, and the answers she'd prepared. She'd been over it so many times that the words had stopped meaning anything around 2 a.m, and so she'd gotten up and made tea and sat at the table with the ledger open in front of her, not reading it, just keeping it company. The baby moved. A long, slow shift, an elbow or a knee pressed briefly against the inside of her ribs, like a small fist knocking. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm working on it." She'd been talking to the baby for about 2 months. She'd started because she was alone, and the silence got heavy, and she'd read somewhere that children heard voices before they were born. She'd kept doing it because it helped. In the same way that writing in the ledger helped, it made the interior thing exterior, gave it a shape she could see. She closed the ledger at 4 in the morning and went to wash her face. The water in the basin was cold. She hadn't let the fire die down enough to let it freeze, but cold was where it was, and cold was what she had. She pressed her wet hands against her face and held them there, and she said to herself the same thing she'd been saying since October, since before October, since the morning in their house in Pittsburgh, when Edmund had looked at her across the breakfast table and told her that the child growing inside her was going to be raised under his conditions, or not at all. And she'd understood in that moment clearly, finally, without any of the fog she'd been living in, that she had run out of ways to stay. She'd said, "I can do this." She said it again now, to her wet hands and the dark window and the 4 walls she'd built herself, and then she dried her face and started getting dressed. The territorial courthouse in Red Willow Crossing was not built for drama. It was a single-story wood-frame building with peeling paint on the east wall and a front step that had been sinking on one side for years. The judge, a gray-whiskered man named Horace Callum, who came through the territory on a rotating circuit, held his proceedings in what was technically the council room, a square space with 8 chairs, a single long table, and a window that faced the alley. Lenora arrived first. She had dressed carefully. Not to impress, she didn't have anything impressive, but deliberately. Her good wool dress, the one she'd repaired twice, with the collar that still sat right. Her hair pinned back the way her mother had taught her, which was plain but not careless. She carried the ledger under her arm and her folder of photographs and Croft's certification in her bag, and she sat down on the left side of the table and set everything out in front of her, with the organized calm of someone who had arranged her materials so many times in her head that her hands knew where things went before she thought about it. Foss arrived 4 minutes later, out of breath, his coat slightly wrong. He'd told her he had another matter at 8, and it had run over. She didn't comment on the coat. Edmund's party arrived at 1/4 the hour. Edmund himself, his Cheyenne attorney, a smooth-headed man named Cartwright, with a posture that communicated expense, and 2 other men she didn't know, who carried the particular look of individuals who had been paid to be present. Edmund saw her sitting there with the ledger and the photographs, and he looked at it for 1/2 second before his face went back to the flat neutral it lived in. Cartwright didn't look at her at all. Judge Callum came in at 1/2, sat down, removed his hat, and looked at the room with the expression of a man who had seen a great many things in courtrooms and found most of them tiresome. "This is a competency petition," he said, to nobody in particular, filed by Edmund Voss against his wife, Lenora Ashcombe, regarding her capacity to manage personal affairs and a minor property claim in this territory. He looked up. "I've read the petition. I've read the response. Let's proceed." "If it please the court," Cartwright began, standing, already into the rhythm of it, the smooth, expensive rhythm of a man who was very good at his job, and knew it. "The petition concerns a woman who has placed herself and her unborn child in conditions that any reasonable party would characterize as dangerous, unstable, and unsuitable." "Mrs. Voss, Miss Ashcombe," Lenora said. Callum looked at her. "She prefers to be addressed as Miss Ashcombe," Voss said quickly, "or Mrs. Ashcombe, using her grandmother's name, which she has formally reclaimed." Cartwright paused less than a second. "The petitioner's wife has claimed, without prior knowledge or consent, a parcel of land in the Red Willow Basin, under conditions that would challenge an able-bodied man with experience in frontier habitation. She is 28 years old, 8.5 months pregnant, and has been living alone on an undeveloped claim through the worst months of the Wyoming winter. She has no legal training, no formal experience in land management, and no community support structure." He paused for effect. "We will show, through the testimony of 4 witnesses, that the respondent's behaviors is a pattern of impulsive decision-making, emotional instability, and disregard for her own and her child's welfare that renders her unfit to manage her own affairs or to raise the child she is carrying without proper supervision." The room was quiet. Lenora wrote 3 words in the margin of her notepad: "No community support." She underlined it once. She'd show him community support. Cartwright's first witness was a man named Gerald Pratt, who claimed to be a physician from Pittsburgh and who testified that he had treated Lenora twice during her marriage for what he called episodes of emotional disturbance and irrational behavior. He had neat handwriting and steady hands and the practiced confidence of someone who had testified before. Foss cross-examined him for 11 minutes. By the end of it, it was established that Gerald Pratt's medical practice in Pittsburgh had been dissolved in 1884 following a licensing dispute, that his continued use of the title physician was a matter of some legal ambiguity, that both of his treatment records for Lenora conveniently predated any independent verification, and that he had been introduced to Edmund Voss's legal team through a mutual acquaintance whose name he was unable to provide without some difficulty. Pratt left the stand looking less steady than he'd arrived. Callum made a note. The second witness was a woman named Margaret Hollis, who described herself as a family friend of the Voss household, and who testified that Lenora had been a source of ongoing concern within their social circle. Erratic, prone to confrontation, often absent from social obligations without reasonable explanation. Lenora looked at Margaret Hollis and thought, "I know you." Not personally, but she knew the type, the woman who had been enlisted to provide respectability, who would say whatever was needed and believe she was doing the right thing, because the man who asked her believed it. And a man's certainty had a way of becoming the air everyone around him breathed. Foss asked Margaret Hollis whether she had personally witnessed any incident of instability. She said she had heard about several. He asked from whom. She said from Edmund himself. He asked whether she had witnessed anything directly. A pause. She was often difficult at dinner parties. Difficult, Foss repeated. Quiet, withdrawn. It made other guests uncomfortable. Foss looked at his notepad. The petitioner's complaint is that Miss Ashcombe is emotionally unstable and incapable of managing her own affairs. Your evidence for this is that she was quiet at dinner parties? Margaret Hollis left the stand looking as though she wished she'd said no when Edmund's man had knocked on her door. The third witness was the one Lenora had been waiting for, because she'd known about him for 3 weeks and she'd been running scenarios in her head about what he might say. His name was Thomas Wick, and he was a man who had briefly worked on the wagon service between Cheyenne and Red Willow in October, who had specifically been one of 2 drivers who'd passed her property in late November and seen her working on the roof in deteriorating weather. He testified that he'd seen a visibly pregnant woman on a rooftop, in conditions that no sensible person would consider safe, hammering in a state of obvious distress, and that he'd thought about stopping but hadn't because the property was set back from the road. This one had more weight. Lenora could feel it. Cartwright let it sit for a moment before handing to Foss. Foss asked Thomas Wick how far from the property he'd been when he observed this. Wick said approximately 200 yards. Foss asked whether he'd stopped. He said no. Foss asked whether he'd reported his concern to anyone at the time, to the sheriff, to a neighbor, to anyone. He said no. Foss asked whether the roof, as far as he could observe at 200 yards, appeared to be completed at the time of his observation. Wick paused. Mostly completed. There was a gap. She was closing it. So she was closing a gap in a roof before a storm, Foss said. And the roof was subsequently completed, as certified by the territorial land agent Ellis Croft, who inspected the property in March and found the structure sound. He held up Croft's certification. Mr. Wick, in your experience, you've driven routes through Wyoming for how many years? 6. In 6 years driving Wyoming territory in winter, have you seen ranch hands and homesteaders working on roofs in cold weather? Yes. And were those individuals considered mentally unstable for doing so? Thomas Wick looked at Cartwright. Cartwright looked at his papers. Callum looked at Wick with the mild patience of a man who was waiting for an honest answer. No, Wick said. Lenora kept her face still. Under the table, her hand pressed flat against the swell of her stomach for just a moment. The fourth witness was the one she hadn't been able to prepare for, because she hadn't known about him until he walked into the room. He was a man named Augustus Reeve, and he identified himself as a land surveyor from Laramie, and he testified calmly, technically, with the assurance of someone presenting facts rather than opinions, that in his professional assessment, the parcel claimed by the respondent had several significant structural vulnerabilities. The creek flooding risk in spring, the rocky soil composition past the first layer, the isolation from any community infrastructure that would support a woman and infant. He had numbers. He had terminology. He presented it with the unhurried authority of expertise. Lenora listened to every word. When he finished, Callum looked at Foss. Foss looked at Lenora. She gave him the smallest nod. Foss stood. Your Honor, the respondent would like to question the witness directly, if permitted. Callum looked at Cartwright, who objected on procedural grounds. Callum overruled him without elaborating and nodded at Lenora. She stood. Augustus Reeve looked at her with the professional blankness of a man who had just been asked to be cross-examined by a pregnant woman and wasn't sure yet how to hold that. Mr. Reeve, she said, you mentioned the creek flooding risk on the east bank. That's correct. Did you visit the property? A pause. I reviewed the original land survey from 1878. That is the most recent. When was the survey conducted, Mr. Reeve? What time of year? He checked his notes. July. July, she said, a dry month, when the creek is at its lowest. She opened her ledger to a tabbed page. I have daily water level measurements taken from the east bank, from November through March, recorded every morning. I also have the rock diversion bank I built in February, which I can provide photographs of, and which Ellis Croft certified during his inspection. The flooding risk you've identified, the low point on the east bank, has been addressed. The 1878 survey does not reflect the current state of the property. She looked at him. Does your assessment account for improvements made since the survey? The survey, does it account for improvements made since 1878? Yes or no? He cleared his throat. No. Thank you, she said, and sat down. The room was very quiet for a moment. She could feel Edmund's eyes on the side of her face. She did not look at him. Cartwright's closing statement was polished. She'd expected that. He was good at his job, and he'd been doing it for years, and he knew how to paint a picture. With the fragments, he had a woman who'd left her husband impulsively, who'd been seen working in dangerous conditions while pregnant, who'd chosen isolation over community, who by her own admission had no formal training in anything she was attempting. He said the word reckless 4 times. He said the word welfare twice in one sentence. He sat down with the confidence of someone who'd done what he was paid to do. Then Foss stood. He was not a dramatic man. He didn't have Cartwright's polish. He had a slight habit of tugging at his collar when he was building to something, which he did now, and then he opened Croft's certification on the table. Your Honor, the respondent's homestead claim has been inspected by a certified territorial land agent and found to constitute a functioning homestead. The physical improvements are consistent with the documented record, which runs to 123 pages. The petitioner's counsel has described the respondent as impulsive, unstable, and incapable of managing her affairs. He looked up. The respondent built a structurally sound cabin, in winter while 6 months pregnant, from a hand-drawn plan that required minimal correction. She documented every nail, every cost, every date, and every material used. She identified a flooding risk on her creek bank and addressed it herself. She planned, planted, and began cultivating a field before the petition hearing that she is currently sitting in. He paused. We would like to call our witness. Garrick Hale walked in. She had not seen him before that moment. Foss had arranged it that way. He'd said it was better for her not to know exactly when Garrick would arrive, because judges read people's reactions to arrivals, and he wanted her reaction to be what it actually was, a woman who had not orchestrated this. Garrick sat down. He had dressed better than she'd ever seen him, which for Garrick meant a clean coat and a collar that was probably stiff and uncomfortable, and he looked like exactly what he was, a man who came from land and money and work, who had been out in Wyoming weather long enough that it showed, and who was sitting in a courtroom chair with the solid composure of someone who'd decided what he was going to say and wasn't going to change it. Foss took him through it methodically. When had he first visited the property? What he'd observed? What work had been completed? What condition the structure was in? What methods the respondent had used to solve problems? He described specifically the wedge system for setting logs, the creek diversion, the roof framing approach that he said, when Foss asked him to compare it, was as sound as anything he'd seen on a structure twice the size. Cartwright cross-examined with the precision of a man looking for a seam. Mr. Hale, you've been visiting this property regularly since October? On and off, yes. And your relationship with the respondent is? I helped her close a roof gap before a storm, Garrick said. After that, I came by occasionally. I helped when she needed an extra pair of hands, and didn't when she didn't. An extra pair of hands, Cartwright repeated. So her ability to complete this homestead is partly dependent on your assistance. No. Cartwright looked up. The work she needed help with was lifting heavy timber at an advanced stage of pregnancy, Garrick said. That's a physical limitation, not a competency one. Any person in that physical condition would need a second person for certain tasks. The planning, the methods, the documentation, she did all of that herself. I watched her figure out problems I wouldn't have known how to approach. You wouldn't have known how to approach them, Cartwright said, and his tone had a slight edge now, the edge of someone who'd found the seam and wasn't sure what was on the other side of it. You're a Hale. Your family has ranched Wyoming for 30 years. Are you saying a woman who'd never built anything is a more competent builder than you? In some respects, Garrick said. He said it without pride and without embarrassment. She'd read more about it than I had. She'd planned more carefully. I've built things by habit and by what was done before me. She built by thinking about why each thing works. That's not the same. Cartwright let the moment hang and then moved to his next question. But Callum was writing something, and Lenora saw it. She took the stand herself last. Foss had asked her whether she wanted to, and she'd said yes without hesitation, because she'd thought about it since October about this specific moment, a room like this, someone asking her to account for herself, and she had things to say that the ledger couldn't say for her. Foss walked her through the basics. The decision to leave Pittsburgh, the claim purchase, the building process, the documented improvements. She answered everything plainly, without embellishment, because embellishment was Edmund's domain, and she'd decided she wasn't going to compete on his territory. Then Cartwright stood. He was careful with her. She'd expected aggression, and he gave her something harder, a gentle, patient condescension, as if he felt genuinely sorry for her misguided choices. He asked about her mental state when she'd left Pittsburgh. He asked, with elaborate courtesy, whether she'd been under strain. He asked whether she agreed that her decision had been, in some respects, sudden. I'd been thinking about it for 3 years, she said. A small pause. 3 years. I started thinking about whether I could leave when I was 25, she said. I didn't go until I was 28. That's not sudden. What prevented you from leaving sooner? The question was framed as sympathy. She looked at him steadily. The same thing that prevents most women from leaving situations like mine. I didn't know where I'd go. I didn't have money that was mine. And I'd been told regularly and effectively that I wasn't capable of managing without my husband's guidance. Cartwright nodded slowly. And yet the decision you made, when you made it, led you to purchase uninhabited land in winter territory while pregnant. I purchased land I could afford, she said. I built a structure I could build. I documented everything I did because I knew, from the day I left, that someone was going to stand in a room exactly like this one and call it reckless. She kept her voice even. The ledger exists because I knew Edmund would come. Every measurement, every date, every cost, I kept them because I understood that the only argument he couldn't buy was a paper record of what was actually done. The room was very still. So your homestead, Cartwright said, and he was still smooth, but something in the smoothness had shifted, was designed, from the beginning, as a legal defense. My homestead, she said, was designed to be a home. The records were designed to prove it. She looked directly at him. Those aren't contradictions. Anybody who's ever had to prove they deserve something they already have would understand that. Cartwright paused. Then he said no further questions. She did not look at Edmund, while Callum wrote. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She looked at the photographs laid out in a row, the cabin in November, the cabin in December, the cabin in February, the creek bank with the stone diversion, the cleared field with the first turned earth. 7 images, taken over 5 months, of a thing becoming what she'd said it would be. Edmund said nothing. He sat across the table with his hands folded, and his face composed in the careful neutral that had taken her years to learn how to read. And she read it now. He was calculating, not panicking. Bram Hale had said Edmund was a man who always had a secondary position, and she believed it. He wasn't beaten yet, and she was not going to diss that he was until the judge said so. Callum stopped writing. He looked at Edmund. Mr. Voss, he said, your petition characterizes your wife as emotionally unstable and incapable of managing her affairs. Your first witness's medical credentials are, at minimum, subject to dispute. Your second witness offered no direct evidence of instability. Your third witness observed a woman doing roof work and considered it alarming, which I do not. Your fourth witness relied on an 8-year-old survey that did not account for subsequent improvements to the property. He picked up Croft's certification. The certified land agent who inspected this claim in March found it constituted a functioning homestead. I have reviewed the documentation personally. He paused just slightly unusually thorough. Edmund's jaw tightened by a fraction. Mr. Cartwright, Callum continued, your framing of the response methods as reckless is inconsistent with the evidence presented. A woman who documents every material cost and construction date is not acting recklessly. She is acting carefully. He set the certification down. I'm going to take a recess and give this my full consideration. We will reconvene in 1 hour, he stood. Everyone in the room stood. The moment Callum's door closed, Edmund turned to Cartwright and said something in a low voice that she couldn't hear. Cartwright answered. Edmund's hand moved flat against the table, not a strike, not quite, just a controlled pressure, a man keeping his reactions inside the shape of them. Lenora picked up her ledger. She walked outside. The spring air was cool and pale and smelled like mud and new grass, and she stood on the sinking front step and breathed it. Foss came out behind her. He was tugging at his collar. Well, he said. Well, she said. He's not decided yet. I know. The fourth witness was the problem. He exhaled. Reeve looked credible. Technical expertise carries weight even when it's outdated. I know. She looked at the alley across from the courthouse. A cat was sitting on a fence post in the sun with its eyes closed. Did I answer that well enough? You answered it correctly, Foss said carefully. Correctly and completely. Whether that's well enough depends on Callum. She nodded. They stood there for a while in the thin spring sun. Your testimony, Foss said eventually. The part about keeping records because you knew Edmund would come. He paused. That was it too much? No. He shook his head. No, it was the right amount. It was honest in a way that was difficult to ignore. He looked at her sideways. Where did you learn to do that? She thought about it for a moment. 7 years of practice, she said, of saying the true thing in a room where no one was going to believe it. Eventually, you figure out the exact register it needs to be said in. Foss was quiet for a moment. He's going to make another move, he said. Edmund. If Callum doesn't rule in his favor today, he'll appeal, or he'll find a different angle. Men like him don't stop at the first hearing. I know, she said. You're prepared for that? She thought about the cabin, the walls, the creek running, the field she'd broken, the 123 pages. I'm prepared for whatever comes next, she said. I've been preparing since October. Inside, a door opened. Foss straightened his coat. She picked up the ledger. They went back in. Callum came back in at exactly 1 hour. Not approximately. Not around. Exactly as if he'd set something to time it, or as if the precision was itself a message about how he ran his proceedings. He sat down, adjusted his papers, and looked at the room with the same mild patience he'd brought to the start of the morning. And Lenora thought, this is a man who has made a lot of decisions in rooms like this, and has learned not to perform the making of them. She had her hands flat on the table. She was not going to grip anything. I've reviewed the full record, Callum said. The petition, the response, the witness testimony, the documentary evidence submitted by the respondent, and the land certification from Ellis Croft. He looked at Edmund. Mr. Voss, your petition alleges that your wife is emotionally unstable, incapable of managing her own affairs, and unfit to raise the child she is carrying. These are serious allegations that require substantive evidence. He paused. What has been presented today does not meet that standard. Edmund did not move. The medical testimony is compromised by questions about the witness's credentials. The character testimony offered no direct observation of any incident that could reasonably be characterized as instability. The observation of the respondent working in cold weather describes behavior consistent with any homesteader managing a property in a Wyoming winter, and I will not treat it as evidence of mental incapacity. Callum looked down at his papers. The land survey testimony raised legitimate structural concerns, all of which the respondent demonstrated have been actively addressed through documented improvements. In my 31 years on this circuit, I have rarely seen a homestead claim supported by documentation of this quality. Cartwright started to stand. I'm not finished, Callum said without raising his voice. Cartwright sat. The respondent's independent homestead claim is legally valid. The improvements are certified and documented. There's no evidence before this court that supports a finding of incompetency. He set his papers flat. The petition is denied. The homestead claim stands. Costs of these proceedings are assessed to the petitioner. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a room where something has been decided, and people are absorbing what that means. Lenora became aware, in a distant way, that her hands were shaking. Not visibly, she had them flat on the table, and she was keeping them flat, but she could feel the tremor running up through her wrists, and she pressed harder against the wood and breathed once, slowly, through her nose. Foss said something beside her. She heard the words but didn't process them. Across the table, Edmund leaned toward Cartwright and said something in a voice too low to carry. Cartwright answered, his own voice equally quiet, and she could see in the set of Cartwright's shoulders the precise quality of a professional delivering a realistic assessment to a man who didn't want one. Callum gathered his papers and stood. Everyone stood. The moment he left the room, the quality of the air changed, that particular release of formal pressure that happens when the authority has exited, and people are free to be themselves again. Foss gripped her arm briefly. "Well done," he said, quietly and quickly, and then released it. She was looking at Edmund. He was looking at her. He didn't say anything yet. He was too controlled for that. He was doing the internal calculation she'd watched him do 1,000 times, sorting through the position, finding the next angle. She knew the process. She'd lived inside its consequences for 7 years. He would not let this be the end. She knew that before he said a word. Foss had told her the same thing outside during the recess. Men like him don't stop at the first hearing. She picked up the ledger. She picked up her folder. She walked out. The front step was still sinking on the left side. She noticed it on the way out the same way she'd noticed it on the way in, with the particular automatic attention she'd developed over the past 7 months for anything structural, anything that was not bearing its weight correctly. She stopped at the bottom of the steps in the spring sun and stood there. Garrick was leaning against the fence across the narrow yard. He'd come out the side door before the ruling, because Foss had said it was better for him not to be in the room when Callum read the decision cleaner in terms of appearances. He straightened when she came out, and she looked at him, and he read her face, and the tension in his shoulders came down a fraction. He denied it, he said. He denied it. Garrick let out a slow breath. Not a dramatic exhale, just the breath of someone who had been holding something and had put it down. "The claim stands," she said. "Good," he said, "just that." She nodded. She looked at the street. Red Willow Crossing in the middle of a May morning, muddy from the spring rains, sun coming through thin clouds, a horse tied in front of the hotel on the far side of the road. Edmund came out of the courthouse behind her. She heard him before she turned, the particular sound of his footsteps on the sinking step, the way he paused at the top of it. When she turned, he was standing there with his coat buttoned and his hat on, and the look of a man who had not yet conceded anything inside himself, even if the judge had conceded it for him. He came down the steps, not toward Garrick, toward her. Garrick pushed off the fence. Lenora lifted her hand slightly, a small gesture at her side, and Garrick stopped. This was hers to finish. Edmund stopped in front of her, close enough that she would have had to step back to make it comfortable. She didn't step back. "You won a ruling," he said. His voice was level. "That's different from winning." "It's what I came here for today," she said. "You've made things significantly more difficult for yourself." He glanced at Garrick, briefly, and then back. "There are other avenues. The territory isn't the last jurisdiction." Edmund. She said his name the way she'd learned to say it in the last months of their marriage, when she'd stopped trying to reach him and started just managing him. "I have a certified homestead. I have a documented claim. I have a legal ruling in my favor, and I have a child due in 3 weeks who is going to be born in the cabin I built." She held his gaze. "If you want to spend more money and more time trying to take that from me, I cannot stop you from trying. But I want you to hear me say it plainly. I am not coming back. There is nothing you can say or file or arrange that will change that, because there is nothing you have that I want. What I have I built, and that's what I'll keep." He looked at her for a long moment. She'd braced for the words, but what he gave her was silence. He turned it over once, whatever calculation was running behind his flat eyes, and then he adjusted his coat and walked past her toward the hotel without speaking. She watched him go. Her heart was going at a pace that was not comfortable for a woman at this stage of pregnancy, and her hands were still doing the low tremor that hadn't quite stopped since Callum's ruling. And she was aware of all of it, and she let herself be aware of it, because this was not the time to pretend she was made of different material than she was. Garrick came to stand beside her. "He'll try again," she said. "Probably. I'll be ready." "I know you will." She looked at the hotel door that had closed behind Edmund. Thank you, she said. For the testimony, I know what it cost. We don't know yet what it cost, he said. That conversation with Bram is still ahead of me. She looked at him. When? Tonight, probably. He knew I was testifying. He's been quiet about it, which is worse than if he'd shouted. Garrick looked at the street. Bram quiet means he's decided something. I just don't know what yet. She thought about saying something reassuring and then didn't, because Garrick knew his uncle better than she did, and reassurance built on ignorance wasn't kindness, it was just noise. Tell me how it goes, she said, I will. She drove home alone, which was how she'd driven in, and she let the horse set his own pace on the familiar road because she was too tired to manage him, and he knew the way. The field was visible from a quarter-mile out the turned earth of the section she'd broken in April, dark and damp from the recent rain, with the first pale green of the rye she'd planted just beginning to show in rows that were not as straight as she'd have liked, but were straight enough to grow something. She unhitched the horse, fed him, and went inside. The cabin was warm from the morning fire she'd banked before leaving. The ledger went on the table. The folder of photographs went on the shelf above the table. She stood in the middle of the room she'd built and looked at it, the uneven floor she'd leveled twice and still wasn't entirely happy with. The window frame Garrick had brought from the Hale property that fit slightly better than the opening she'd made for it. The bed in the corner with the frame that was still slightly off level on one side. She sat down at the table. She opened the ledger to the next blank page and wrote the date, and under it, petition denied. Homestead confirmed. She wrote Callum's name and the cost assessment. She wrote the date and time and closed it. Then she put her head down on her arms on the table, and she was asleep in approximately 3 minutes, which was the first real sleep she'd had in 36 hours. And she didn't wake up until the afternoon light had moved all the way across the floor. The news about Garrick reached her 2 days later, not from Garrick himself, but from Ruth Pettifer, who had it from her husband, who had it from a man who did occasional work for the Hale Ranch. Bram had removed Garrick from the ranch operation. Not cut him out entirely, not disinherited, not formally severed, but reassigned him to a reduced role with no management authority, no decision-making position, and a clear message delivered through the particulars of it that Garrick's future in the Hale enterprise was contingent on his conduct going forward. The personal cattle Garrick had been building over 5 years, his own small herd kept separate from the ranch stock, would need to be sold if he wanted to stay on the property, because Bram was not going to have independent operations running alongside his own by someone who demonstrated independent judgment in a direction Bram hadn't approved. Ruth told her all of this plainly, in the way Ruth told things, watching her face. Is he still on the ranch? Lenora asked, for now. But the word is he's looking. She drove out to the Hale property that afternoon without entirely deciding to. She'd told herself she was going to the far end of her own land to check the creek bank, and then she'd found herself on the road south instead, which was either instinct or stubbornness or both. Garrick was in the south pasture, mending a section of fence, which was exactly the kind of task given to someone who was being shown what their standing now was, and he looked up when he heard her wagon without surprise. She pulled up, I heard. Word travels, he said. He pulled a strand of wire taut and twisted it. Are you all right? I'm fine, Garrick. He stopped. He looked at the wire in his hands, and then he set down the pliers and turned around. He looked tired in a way he usually managed not to show, not physically. He was built for physical work, and it didn't mark him that way. But somewhere behind his eyes, the careful equanimity he carried was wearing thin at the edges. I knew what Bram would do, he said. I told you I knew. I wasn't surprised. He looked at the fence line. It still ends different than you expect, is all. Knowing and experiencing aren't the same thing. No, she said. They're not. I'm going to sell the cattle. She looked at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He picked up the pliers again. I've been thinking about it since before the hearing. There's a parcel adjacent to your east boundary that's been sitting unsold for 2 seasons. Rocky ground on the north section, good grass on the south, and an existing well that just needs cleaning. The price reflects the north section. He glanced at her. My cattle are worth more than the asking price. Enough to buy it and have something left for stock. She stared at him. You're not doing this because of me, she said. I'm doing it because I've been working land that isn't mine for 15 years, and I'd like to work some that is, he said, and pulled the wire taut again. You're adjacent. That's geography, not obligation. Garrick, you told me I make my own choices, he said. I do. This is one of them. She sat on the wagon seat with the reins in her hands and looked at him, at the fence he was mending and the land stretching beyond it, and the way he held himself when he was doing something physical, which was the way he held himself through everything, with a kind of settled attention that she had been watching for 7 months without letting herself name what she was watching. The north section soil might be recoverable, she said finally, if you break it deep enough and let it rest a season. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted toward something she couldn't quite read and wasn't sure she was ready to. Is that right? The rock composition on that end of the basin tends to be surface only. 3 feet down, it usually breaks into decent loam. She looked at the fence line. I read about it, after I saw the survey for my own parcel. Of course you did, he said. He was almost smiling. I'm just saying, it's not as bad as the price suggests. Good to know, he said. He went back to the wire. She drove home with the particular unsettled feeling of someone who has said the thing they meant and isn't sure what comes next, and who is too honest to pretend the unsettlement isn't there. Edmund left Red Willow Crossing on a Thursday. She didn't witness the leaving. She heard about it the way she heard about most things through Ruth, through the specific social current that ran through the town's daily dealings, a current she'd learned to read and to trust for accuracy, even when it was unkind. He and Cartwright had spent 2 days after the ruling in quiet consultation at the hotel. Clara's next telegram she'd taken to sending them with some regularity, which Lenora suspected was partly information and partly her friend's way of feeling useful from a distance, confirmed that Edmund had been seen visiting the Cheyenne District Court office on the afternoon of the second day. Foss came to her property the morning after Edmund's departure. She saw his wagon from the field and came in, wiping her hands on her work apron. He was standing outside the cabin door with his hat in his hands and the expression he wore when he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to say. Sit down, she said, and opened the door. He sat. She made coffee, because there was nothing else to offer, and Foss worked better with something to hold. He's filed a second motion, Foss said. Not another competency petition. Different approach. He accepted the coffee. He's petitioning for paternity rights and custodial claim to the child, independent of the competency question. His argument is that regardless of your legal capacity, the child's father has standing to petition for custody arrangements, and that raising an infant on an isolated frontier homestead without adequate resources constitutes endangerment. She sat down. He can do that, she said. He has standing to file. Whether he has grounds is a different question. Foss wrapped both hands around the mug. It's a different kind of fight, Lenora. The competency question was about you. This one's about the baby, about what a judge considers adequate circumstances for an infant. She looked at the window. Outside, the field was green and moving slightly in the morning wind. He waited, she said. He let the first ruling happen, and then he pivoted. Yes. He knew he went to the Cheyenne court office the same day we were talking outside the courthouse. He already had the secondary petition drafted before Callum ruled. Foss was quiet for a moment. Probably. So the first petition was partly theater, partly to see what I had. She pressed her hand flat against the table. And now he knows. He's seen the ledger, he's heard the testimony, he knows exactly what my case looks like. And he's come back with something I can't answer the same way. You can answer it, Foss said carefully. But the answer is different. The competency case was about what you'd built. This case is about what you're providing. He's going to argue the homestead is insufficient for an infant isolation, medical access, financial stability. He's going to put the child at the center instead of you. She thought about the baby, the weight of her, the way she moved, the way Lenora had been talking to her for 2 months, because she was alone and the silence got heavy. She was due in 3 weeks. Edmund had timed this deliberately. A custody petition filed before the birth, forcing her into another legal proceeding at the worst possible moment. She would be giving birth while simultaneously preparing a second defense. He had calculated that. He knew her well enough to know what the timing would cost. What do we need, she said. Foss set down his mug. Evidence of stability. Not the building, you have that. Evidence of community support, medical access, financial continuity. A clear picture of what the child's life looks like, not just what the property looks like. He paused. And honestly, witnesses who can speak to that. People who've been involved. Not just Garrick. She thought about Ruth Pettifer, who had told her things without being asked to, and who had sent her neighbor Vera to ask about the storage shed. She thought about Ellis Croft, who had said the documentation was unusual, and meant it as a compliment. She thought about the 3 other homesteaders who had come to her with questions in April about soil drainage and roof framing, and who had sat at her table and talked for an hour about nothing and everything. She thought about the woman Colleen Marsh had described in December alone, pregnant, back before Christmas, and how wrong she'd been. "I have people," she said. Foss looked at her. "I know that's not how it felt 6 months ago," she said, "but I have people now." The next 2 weeks were a kind of organized chaos she hadn't experienced before, different from the building chaos of winter, which had been her against the materials and the weather. This was her among people, and she was less practiced at that and made more mistakes. She went to Ruth first, because Ruth was direct and because she trusted direct people more than kind ones' kindness could be performed. Directness was harder to fake. Ruth said yes before she finished asking. "What do you need from me specifically?" Ruth said. "A statement. What you've seen at the property, what you know about the work, when we first met, what's happened since. Anything about medical access. I've been seeing the doctor here once a month. You may have seen me." "I've seen you every visit," Ruth said. "Dr. Halloran keeps office hours on Thursday, and you're there every second Thursday. I've watched him chase off 2 men who made comments in the waiting room while you were there." She said it with a certain satisfaction. "I'll write whatever statement you need." Ellis Croft sent a written response to Foss's inquiry within 48 hours, saying he would be available to testify again, and that his certification spoke for itself, but he was prepared to expand on it. 3 of the homesteaders who'd come to her in April, a man named Pete Schaefer and his wife, and a widow named Dorothy Crane, who ran 20 acres to the northwest, came to the property together one afternoon, which Lenora hadn't arranged, and said they'd heard about the second petition through the kind of network that small communities run on, and that they intended to be available as witnesses. She stood in the yard while Pete Schaefer told her this, and she didn't trust herself to say much. "You fixed our drainage problem," his wife said, which was how they described it, the conversation they'd had in April, where Lenora had looked at their creek situation and suggested a solution in about 15 minutes. "We'd been fighting that problem for 2 years. Seems like the least we can do." "I didn't fix it," Lenora said. "I told you what I thought might work." "It worked," Dorothy Crane said flatly. "Close enough." Foss built the response to the custody petition around 3 pillars, which he explained to her at the table with his notepad and his collar-tugging habit, and the particular precision of a man who was actually quite good at his job when he wasn't running late. Medical access, documented and testified. Community integration, demonstrated through multiple relationships formed over the 7 months of residence. Financial stability, supported by the homestead records and the projected income from the spring crop. "The crop isn't producing yet," Lenora said. "The crop is planted, certified, and documented," Foss said. "For the purposes of this petition, that's what matters. He can't argue financial instability when the evidence shows an active, developing agricultural operation." She looked at the ledger. 141 pages now. "And the isolation argument? You have neighbors within reasonable distance who have testified to active community relationship." The isolation argument was stronger in October. "It's not strong now." He paused. "You've done something unusual, Lenora. You've turned 7 months of individual effort into a network. I'm not sure you did it deliberately." "I didn't," she said. "It doesn't matter. It's there." Garrick bought the east parcel on a Friday in mid-May, 3 days before her due date. She knew about it because he drove past her claim on his way back from the land office and stopped. She was in the field when she heard the wagon. She came out to the fence. He had a receipt in his hand that he held up, and she thought that was the most Garrick thing she'd ever seen, the simplest possible evidence of the simplest possible fact, offered without commentary. "You really did it," she said. "I said I was going to." She looked at the receipt. The parcel's number was the one she'd looked up herself in March, when she'd thought about telling him about it and then decided it wasn't her place. "Did Bram doesn't have a say in what I do with my own money," Garrick said. "That's the point of having your own money. Is he angry?" Garrick was quiet for a moment. "He's something," he said. "I'm not sure angry is the right word. He looked at me when I told him, and it was, I've known that man since I was 4 years old, and I've never seen that particular expression before." He folded the receipt. "I think he might be reconsidering some things, but that's his work to do, not mine." She nodded. "The well on the north end needs cleaning," he said, "and the pasture gate is hanging wrong. I'll start there." "The soil on the north section," she said, 3 feet down. Decent loam, he said. You told me. I just wanted to make sure you remembered. He looked at her across the fence with the late afternoon sun at his back, and that expression she'd been watching for 7 months, without naming steady particular, aimed at her with a kind of attention that had nothing to do with pity or obligation, and she held it for a moment and then looked at her field. Edmund's second petition, she said. I know about it. Foss is confident about the response. We have good witnesses. I'll testify again, Garrick said, if Foss wants me to. He might. The circumstances are different. I know. He didn't add anything to that. He didn't need to. She looked at the field. The rye was coming in steadily now, green and ordered. Plots not as straight as she'd have liked, but straight enough. She'd planted it in April, with her hands and her back, and a borrowed planter that kept catching on the rocky sections, and she'd adjusted for the catches and kept going, and it was growing. I think, she said, and stopped. He waited. I think I would have managed, she said, without the testimony, without the neighbors. I would have found a way. I believe that, he said, but it's different. She looked at her hands. Better, probably. I'm still figuring out how to hold that. Take your time, he said. She almost laughed. I'm 3 days from my due date, and I have a custody petition in play, and I have 40 acres that need attention. All right, take limited time, he said. And she did laugh then, which surprised her enough that she put her hand over her mouth for a moment. He smiled. It was a real smile, not the careful one he deployed in company, and she watched it and felt the familiar pull of the thing she'd been not naming since December, and this time she let it sit without pushing it away. She didn't know what came next. She had a child coming and a legal fight still pending, and a homestead that needed another season's work before it would actually be secure. She had a man who'd bought the parcel next door and was talking about well cleaning and pasture gates, and she had no idea what shape anything was going to take from here. But she had the ledger. She had 141 pages and a field that was growing and walls that had stood through a Wyoming winter, and she had people who had shown up without being asked to show up, which was the thing she had least expected. When she drove out of Cheyenne in October with her carpet bag and her construction drawing and $40 in her coat pocket, she had built something here. All of it. The baby came on a Tuesday. Not the Tuesday she'd expected, not the one Foss had been nervously timing his legal preparation around, but the Tuesday before a week early, which in Lenora's experience was exactly how important things arrived, ahead of when you thought you were ready for them and not particularly interested in your schedule. She woke at 3 in the morning with a low, grinding pressure that she recognized from the reading she'd done, the same 30-cent manual she'd bought in Cheyenne along with everything else. The one Edmund would have taken from her if he'd seen it, because he would have said it was not appropriate material for a woman of her station. She'd read it twice through and made notes in the margins. She got up and built the fire up and put water on. Then she went to the door and looked out at the dark, because Ruth Pettifer had made her promise, had made her actually say the words out loud, that she would send for help when labor began, and not try to manage it alone. Ruth had been very specific about this. Ruth was specific about most things, which was why Lenora trusted her. She stood at the door for a moment, measuring the dark and the distance and the particular quality of what her body was doing, and she decided Ruth was right. She saddled the horse herself, which took longer than it should have, because her hands were not entirely steady, and the horse was unhappy about being woken at 3 in the morning and made his feelings known by shifting continuously. She tied a note to the Schaefer fence post. Pete Schaefer had agreed to relay messages because his farm sat between her claim and the town road, and drove back to the cabin and waited. Ruth arrived with Dr. Halloran before 6. The doctor was a compact, unhurried man who had delivered a significant portion of Red Willow Crossing's population and had the manner of someone who had seen everything twice and was not going to be dramatic about any of it. He looked at Lenora and said, "How far apart?" And she told him, and he said, "We have time. Sit down," and she sat down. Ruth made tea that nobody drank and then made more, and she sat beside the bed and held Lenora's hand during the worst of it, without saying anything encouraging or reassuring, which was exactly right, because Lenora did not want encouragement. She wanted presence, and Ruth understood the difference. The labor was 11 hours. It was brutal in the specific way that all honest physical struggle is brutal, not dramatic, not noble. Just long and hard, and at several points seemingly without end. Lenora did not handle it gracefully. She said things she wouldn't repeat. She cried once from pure exhaustion around hour 8, and she told Dr. Halloran at one point that she wanted to stop, which he acknowledged with the steady patience of someone who knew she couldn't, and she knew she couldn't, and they both understood that saying, it was just the mind's way of protesting an event it had no authority over. At 2 in the afternoon, Evelyn Ashcombe arrived. She was small and purple-faced and furious about something, expressing her fury at considerable volume, and Lenora held her and felt the world reorganize itself around this new fact, this particular weight, this particular voice, this pair of eyes that were dark and unfocused and would figure things out eventually. She's healthy, Halloran said, in the tone of a man delivering the most important sentence in any room. I know, Lenora said, though she hadn't known. Not really. Not until this moment. Ruth was crying. She was doing it quietly, turned slightly toward the window, pretending she wasn't, which was so unlike Ruth's usual directness that Lenora almost laughed but didn't have the energy. Her name's Evelyn, Lenora said. That's a good name, Ruth said to the window. Ashcombe, Lenora added, not Voss, not ever Voss. Ruth turned around. Her eyes were red. Obviously, she said, which was the most Ruth thing she could have said, and this time Lenora did laugh, quietly, because Evelyn had finally stopped crying and was doing something with her face that might have been settling, or might have been preparing for another round. Garrick came that evening. He didn't come inside immediately. He stood at the door when Ruth opened it and looked at Ruth first, because he was a man who read rooms by starting with the people nearest the entrance, and Ruth's face told him what he needed to know. She's all right, he said. She's tired, Ruth said, and the baby's fine. Come in or don't, but make a decision. He came in. Lenora was sitting up in the bed with Evelyn in the crook of her arm, and she looked at Garrick when he came around the corner, and she was too exhausted for any of the careful management she usually applied to her face. So what he saw was just her tired and undone, and holding a 6-hour-old person with a slightly dazed look of someone whose whole world had just reorganized around a new center of gravity. He stood near the door. He didn't come closer. She's small, Lenora said. She looks like enough, he said. She was loud earlier. I heard. He'd been outside for part of the afternoon, she realized, not intruding just there in case. She looked down at Evelyn. She has Edmund's coloring, she said. It was something she'd noticed and needed to say out loud to make it sit flat. Dark hair, fair skin. The coloring would be what it was, and she would make her peace with it. She has your hands, Garrick said. Lenora looked at Evelyn's hands, curled against her chest. She hadn't noticed. She looked for a moment. Maybe, she said. He stayed for half an hour. He didn't hold the baby, he didn't ask, and she didn't offer, not today. Today was too new for that, but he sat in the chair near the wall and was present in the way he was present at her fence when he had something to say and hadn't found the words yet, and she let his presence be what it was without analyzing it, because she was too tired to analyze anything, and it turned out that was its own kind of relief. When he left, he said, I'll check the field in the morning. The rye doesn't need, I know what the rye needs, he said gently. Sleep, she slept. The second hearing was in June. Voss had been preparing for it in parallel with everything else, which meant Lenora had been preparing for it in parallel with a newborn and a field that needed attention and a body that was recovering from 11 hours of labor at a pace she found deeply unsatisfying. She told Voss at their first meeting after Evelyn's birth that she needed to know the realistic picture, not the encouraging one. He gave her the realistic one. Edmund's custody petition had more traction than the competency case because it asked a different question. Not is this woman capable, but is this environment sufficient for a child? The first question Lenora could answer with documentation. The second question required her to prove a negative, to demonstrate that the things Edmund would call deficiencies were not actually deficiencies. The isolation argument is the one we need to break, Voss said. He's going to stand in front of a judge and say this child is being raised miles from medical care, miles from a school, miles from any community infrastructure, and that a woman managing 40 acres alone cannot provide what an infant needs. I'm not managing it alone, Lenora said. Correct. And that's what we build the case on. He looked at his notepad. Ruth's statement. Halloran's statement he delivered the baby on site. That's significant. It demonstrates access. Croft's certification of the homestead as a functioning and improving operation. The Schaefers, Dorothy Crane, and Garrick. Will Bram try to stop him testifying again? Voss was quiet for a moment. Garrick tells me he's moved his cattle and is living on the east parcel. She looked at him. He's no longer on Hale land, Voss said carefully. which means Bram's leverage over his testimony is significantly reduced. She looked at Evelyn, asleep in the small cradle Garrick had built, and left at her door one morning without knocking, which she'd found when she went to feed the horse. It was not a refined piece of work. The joints were slightly rough, and one of the rockers sat unevenly on the floor, and he'd probably done it in an evening from leftover timber, but it held the baby and moved correctly and was, in the specific way of things built by hands for a purpose, exactly what it needed to be. He didn't tell me, she said. He didn't want it to look like he was doing it for the testimony, Foss said. I believe that's accurate, but he also told me to tell you, because he said you'd rather know. She was quiet for a moment. He's right, she said. I'd rather know. The June hearing was different from the May one. The room was the same peeling paint on the courthouse exterior, same sinking step, same square council room with 8 chairs, but the dynamic had shifted in ways Lenora felt before she could articulate them. Edmund arrived with Cartwright and his 2 background men, same formation as before, but something in the formation was different. Tighter, more defensive. He had not expected her to have people. She saw it when she walked in with Ruth and Foss and found Ellis Croft already seated, and Dr. Halloran beside him, and Pete Schaefer with his wife at the end of the row, and Dorothy Crane in the chair nearest the window with her arms folded, and the expression of a woman who had walked 8 miles of Wyoming terrain to be in this room and was not going to be moved for any reason. Edmund's eyes moved across them, counting, calculating. She sat down and opened the ledger on the table in front of her, turned to the section she'd begun. After Evelyn's birth, a new chapter, documenting the homestead's evolution into something that now held a child as well as a woman, and she set the photographs beside it. 7 from before the hearing, 4 more from the past month. Evelyn in the cradle, Evelyn on the porch in the morning sun, the field with the rye standing steady and green. The judge for this proceeding was not Callum. He was a younger man named Pryor, circuit judge from Laramie, and he had the careful attentiveness of someone who wanted to get things right rather than get them done, which could go either way, but she decided to take it as a good sign because she didn't have the energy for pessimism. Cartwright's approach had evolved. He'd been efficient in May, precise and smooth. In June, he was something more careful. He had clearly absorbed the outcome of the first hearing and adjusted, which was what competent people did, and which meant he was harder to predict. He didn't attack Lenora directly. He built instead, slowly and methodically, a picture of a homestead that was admirable but insufficient a testament to one woman's remarkable effort that was nonetheless not what an infant required. He used the word remarkable 3 times in his opening, which Lenora recognized as a technique, elevate the accomplishment, so the argument isn't about capability but about circumstance. He wasn't calling her incompetent. He was calling the situation inadequate. It was a smarter frame, and she'd known it was coming, and she'd prepared for it, and she was still sitting in the chair, absorbing it with the specific tension of someone who knows their counterarguments are good but cannot be certain they're good enough. Ruth testified first. She was Ruth on the stand, direct, specific, unimpressed by the proceedings, and clearly the kind of witness who makes a courtroom slightly nervous, because she was going to say exactly what she thought, and not what she was supposed to think. She described the Thursday medical appointments. She described Lenora's conversations with Halloran about the birth preparation, which she'd been present for twice. She described the evening she'd spent at the homestead in April, helping Lenora turn the south section of the field, because it had needed 2 people, and Dorothy Crane had a sick animal that day. She described the community of people who had formed around the property, organically and practically, because Lenora was the most useful neighbor any of them had met. Useful, Cartwright said during cross. You'd describe a woman raising a newborn on an isolated homestead as useful. I'd describe her as useful to the people around her. Yes, Ruth said, which makes her less isolated than your paperwork suggests. Cartwright moved on. Halloran testified to the birth, the note, the relay system, his arrival before 6, the 11-hour labor, the healthy outcome. He described the homestead's physical suitability, the cleanliness of the space, the preparation he'd observed. He said, when Cartwright asked whether he had concerns about a newborn in that environment, that his concerns were the same he'd have about any newborn, anywhere that infants were fragile and the world was uncertain, but that in terms of the specific environment, he had visited twice since the birth and found the child thriving and the mother managing with competence. Competence, Cartwright said. Yes, Halloran said, with the finality of a man who delivered 300 children and was not going to debate the word. The Schaefers testified together, which the judge allowed, given the straightforwardness of their account. They described the drainage problem, the solution, the working relationship that had developed. Dorothy Crane testified that she'd been to the homestead 4 times since March, and that the child's cradle, which she'd seen on her most recent visit, was as solid a piece of work as anything she'd seen built in this territory. Lenora saw Cartwright write something on his notepad when Dorothy said that. Then Garrick took the stand. He'd been last on purpose Foss's structure, the same instinct he'd had in May, that Garrick's testimony landed differently when it came after everything else had established the foundation. He sat with the same solidity he always carried, his coat clean, his hands steady, and he looked at Pryor and answered Foss's questions the way he'd answered Callum's plainly, without embellishment, describing what he'd seen. He described moving to the east parcel. The distance between his property and Lenora's close enough to reach in minutes on horseback. He described the cradle. He said, when Foss asked him directly about his involvement with the homestead, that he was a neighbor and intended to be a useful one, and that this was a choice he'd made, for reasons that were his own and that he didn't intend to explain away. Cartwright came at him sideways. Mr. Hale, you've moved to a property adjoining the respondent's claim. You've built furniture for the child. You've testified twice on the respondent's behalf. At what point does your involvement become the real support structure for this homestead, rather than the respondent's own capacity? Garrick looked at Cartwright. At what point, Garrick said, does having a neighbor stop being a vulnerability and start being a community? Pryor looked up from his writing. The respondent built this homestead, Garrick said. She built it before I came. She directed everything I contributed. And every time I've seen her face a problem I didn't know how to approach, she'd already figured it out before I arrived. I didn't give her stability. She built stability, and I moved next to it because I had sense enough to recognize what it was. He held Cartwright's gaze. The fact that she has neighbors now is evidence of her success, not her dependence. Cartwright had no more questions. Lenora took the stand last, and this time it was different from May. In May, she'd been defending herself, explaining herself, offering evidence to counter a case built on her inadequacy. In June, she'd come through a birth and a recovery, and 6 weeks of managing a newborn on a working homestead, and she had nothing left for performance. What Pryor got was just her unvarnished, clear-eyed, and tired, in the way that strips away everything except what's actually true. Foss asked her to describe a typical day on the homestead now, with the baby. She described it. The early mornings, the feeding schedule she'd worked out, the way she'd arranged the fieldwork to happen in 2-hour windows while Evelyn slept. The evenings on the porch, when the light was good, and the baby was awake, and she could sit and look at the 40 acres that were hers, and know that everything in them was the result of a decision she'd made freely. Pryor asked her, not Foss, not Cartwright, but Pryor himself, leaning slightly forward, Miss Ashcombe, what would you say to a judge who is genuinely uncertain whether a homestead this remote is a suitable environment for an infant? The room was quiet. She looked at him. I'd say that remote isn't the same as unsupported. I have a doctor who came to my door at 6 in the morning. I have neighbors who know my relay system and use it. I have a community that formed around the work rather than around proximity, which means it's more durable than geography. She paused. And I'd say that the alternative being proposed, returning this child to a household controlled by the man who filed a false competency petition against her mother, who paid for witnesses, who timed a custody filing to coincide with a birth, is not a safer environment. It's a more comfortable one. Those are not the same thing. Pryor wrote for a moment. Then he looked at Edmund. Edmund had been very still for most of the hearing, in the way Lenora had learned to recognize as controlled anger, the absence of reaction as a form of reaction. She could see, from where she was sitting, the moment he understood which way the room had moved. Not in a dramatic shift. Just a quiet adjustment in the set of his jaw, the internal repositioning of a man who was calculating his next move before this one was officially over. Pryor took 30 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying his written notes, and he sat down and he said, "The petition is denied. The child, Evelyn Ashcombe, is in the legal custody of her mother. The homestead is recognized as a suitable environment. The petitioner has not demonstrated that the respondent's circumstances constitute endangerment." He said it in 47 words, and then he gathered his papers and left. The room breathed. Edmund stood. Cartwright put a hand on his arm briefly and said something low. Edmund shook it off. He walked to the door and he stopped there, his back to the room, and Lenora watched him and waited. He turned around. He looked at her across the space of the room, and she looked back, and she thought, this is the last time. She didn't know how she knew it, but she did. There was something in his face that had shifted from calculation to something older and less manageable. He had run out of angles. He had spent money and time and legal ingenuity trying to recover something he'd decided was his, and a territorial judge had told him twice that it wasn't, and the witnesses he'd bought hadn't held. And the woman he'd spent 7 years telling she was incapable of anything had built 40 acres of evidence that she was. He left without speaking. She heard his footsteps on the sinking step. Then she sat in the chair for a moment and let herself be done. Ruth drove her home, which she hadn't asked for but accepted, and they didn't talk much on the ride, which was fine. The country was green in the particular way of Wyoming in June, not the lush, overwhelming green of somewhere with more rain, but a clean, spare green, the color of things that had worked hard to grow. Evelyn was asleep when they got back, in the care of Dorothy Crane, who had stayed at the homestead during the hearing, with the matter-of-fact reliability that had become Dorothy's signature contribution to Lenora's life. Dorothy handed the baby over and said she ate and she slept and she's fine, and left, because Dorothy was not a person who lingered. Ruth left too, after making sure there was food, which there was. Lenora sat in the chair by the window with Evelyn and looked at the field. The rye was tall now. Not as straight as she'd have liked. The rocky sections had pushed some of the rows offline, but it was standing and it was real. And in another 6 weeks, she'd be able to sell the first harvest from her first crop on her own land, and the money would go back into the homestead, and the homestead would grow. It would not grow smoothly. That was something she'd made her peace with somewhere around February, when the thaw had started, and she'd found 3 places in the cabin wall that needed rechinked, and the creek bank that needed banking, and the field that needed breaking, all of it at once, all of it imperfect, all of it hers. Nothing built by hand is ever exactly what the plan said it would be. The plan is where you start. The thing you build is what negotiation with reality produces. Every adjustment, every moment where you had to stop and say, all right, this didn't work, try again. That's not failure. That's just what building is. She had been afraid, in October, of the specific kind of failure that comes from trying and falling short publicly, in front of people who already expected you to fail. She had been afraid Edmund's voice in her head was right. She had been afraid that the thing she was reaching for was not actually reachable. She had tried anyway. That was the thing she wanted Evelyn to know. Someday, in whatever words fit the moment. Not that it had worked out. Outcomes weren't the lesson. Outcomes were what happened after the lesson. The lesson was the trying. The lesson was getting up in the dark and making tea and opening the ledger and doing the next thing, even when the next thing was hard and the one after that was harder. The lesson was that fear was real, and you could hold it and keep working anyway. She'd been told she was not capable. She'd been told it long enough and consistently enough that she'd half believed it, which was the thing about being told something by the person who was supposed to know you best. It gets its hooks in deep. It took a cabin and a Wyoming winter, and a judge ruling twice in her favor, to understand that the voice telling her she couldn't had never been a reliable narrator. It had been a man trying to keep her manageable. Evelyn stirred, made the small sound she made when she was deciding whether to sleep more or be awake. Lenora shifted her slightly and she settled. She was going to be her own person, this child. Already she had opinions about the angle of light and the temperature of things, and the amount of time she was willing to wait for anything. Already Lenora could see the outline of a will that was going to make her life interesting. Good, she thought. Good. Garrick came over that evening, crossing from the east parcel on horseback, and he didn't pretend he hadn't been watching for the wagon to come back. He tied his horse and came to where she was sitting on the porch, and he sat on the step, and she told him Pryor's ruling in 2 sentences, and he nodded once and was quiet. After a while he said, "What does it feel like?" She thought about it honestly. "Mostly like relief," she said. "Which I know isn't. It's not triumphant. It's just, you've been fighting since October," he said. "Yes." Relief makes sense. She looked at the field. "I thought it would feel bigger. Like something completed." She shifted Evelyn. "It doesn't feel completed. It feels like the part where you've cleared the ground, and now you have to actually figure out what to build. That's not the worst feeling." "No," she said, "it's not." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need to tell you something." She waited. "I came to your property in October to assess it for my uncle," he said. "You know that. I told you that the same night." He looked at his hands. "What I didn't tell you is that I came back the second time because I wanted to, and every time after that, and that I was aware of it. And I didn't say anything because you were managing a legal fight and a pregnancy and a Wyoming winter, and the last thing you needed was someone else making claims on your attention." He looked at her. "But it's been 9 months now, and you've won both hearings, and I'd like to say it plainly if you don't mind." She held his gaze. "I'd like to be here," he said. "Not because you need me, you've established past any argument that you don't need me, but because I want to be, and because I think you might want that too, and I don't want to assume, but I wanted to say it." The sun was low, doing what Wyoming evenings did in June, spreading gold across the green in a way that would have been overwhelming in some other landscape, but here felt right, felt scaled to the thing it was illuminating. "I do," she said, "want that." He looked at her steadily. "Even with everything it's complicated by." "Garrick," she said, "I built a cabin at 7 months pregnant in a Wyoming winter. I'm not afraid of complicated." He almost smiled. "No, you're not. What I am is," she stopped. Started again. "I'm particular about how things work. I need it to be equal. In all the ways that matter, my land, my name, my decisions. I know. I'm telling you because I need you to actually know it, not just hear it." "I know," he said, and the way he said it, quiet and solid, and carrying 7 months of proof behind it, she believed him. She looked at Evelyn, asleep on her arm, with a particular depth of sleep that infants had, complete and trusting and located nowhere but the present moment. "Ask me again in a while," she said, "when we've had more time." "All right," he said, "I can do that." The summer that followed was not easy, and it was not simple, and it was not what any story would call a peaceful resolution, because there was no peaceful resolution. There was just the next season, the next task, the next problem that needed solving. Edmund filed no third petition. Whether that was Cartwright's counsel, or the cost of 2 failed hearings, or something that had shifted in the man himself, she didn't know and decided not to spend energy wondering about. He had existed at the center of her life for 7 years. He did not get to exist at the center of her thoughts anymore. The rye harvest came in July, imperfect and real, enough to cover the seed cost and the borrowed equipment, and put a small amount back into the ledger under future materials. Garrick's well came clean in June, and his south pasture grass was better than either of them had hoped, and his north section 3 feet down, as she'd said. Decent loam went under the plow in August for the following spring. She helped him with it. He helped her with the south fence she'd been putting off since April. They worked on each other's land with the easy practicality of 2 people who had figured out that the work was the conversation, and the conversation was what they were building, and neither of them was in a hurry to call it finished. Bram Hale came to her property in August. He came alone, same as before, but different in some ways she couldn't immediately name. He stood at the fence, and she went to the fence, same as before, but he didn't have the look of a man arriving to arrange something. He looked like a man who had been thinking and had come to say what he'd decided. "I heard about the second ruling," he said. "Yes. 2 for 2, he said. "It wasn't quite praise, it wasn't quite neutrality. It was the thing in between, from a man who was recalibrating." "Yes," she said. He looked at the field, the cabin, the east parcel where Garrick's new fence line was visible. He looked at all of it for a long moment. "He's not coming back to the ranch," Bram said. "Not a question. That's not my decision," she said. "I know whose decision it is." He looked at her. He made a choice I didn't like, and I reacted the way I react, which is hard." He said it with the specific difficulty of someone who is not accustomed to examining their own reactions out loud. "I'm not saying I was wrong to have concerns. You can have whatever concerns you want," she said. "I'm saying," he stopped. "He didn't disgrace the name," he said. "That's what I'm saying. It took me a while to see it that way, but," he adjusted his hat. "He did what he thought was right. That's a Hale thing to do. Even when I'd rather he'd done it differently." She held his gaze. "He'd probably like to hear that from you." Bram looked at the east parcel. "I expect he'll hear it when he's ready to," he said, which was Bram's way of saying he'd say it when he could manage it, which was as honest as Bram Hale was probably capable of being, and she respected it for what it was. He rode out. That evening she told Garrick what had been said, standing at his fence line in the late light, and watched his face take it in. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "That's a start," and went back to what he was doing, which was checking the new fence posts, pressing each one to feel how well it was seated. She watched him for a moment. Then she said, "Is it enough?" He considered. "I don't know yet, but it's something." He pressed a post. Pressed the next one. "It's not nothing." That was true. In Lenora's experience, not nothing was where most things started. When people in Red Willow Crossing talked about her in those years, and they did, because small places remember things, and she had given them something worth remembering, they described her as the woman who built her own home. Some of them meant it as a fact about construction. Some of them meant something larger. She'd built a homestead. She'd built a case. She'd built a community out of practical need and unexpected generosity, and the kind of accumulated trust that only forms between people who have shown up for each other, without being asked to. She'd built, slowly and with significant difficulty, something she might eventually call a life shared with someone who had never once tried to take the hammer out of her hand. She had not built any of it cleanly. The floor was still uneven on one side. The fence rows still weren't as straight as she wanted them. The rye rows had wavered around the rocky sections, and she'd had to accept that wavering as part of the crop. Evelyn, at 3 months, had opinions about sleep that were not consistent with anyone's preferred schedule, and made these opinions known at volume. None of it was what the plan said it would be. All of it was hers. The hammer she'd been using the night, Garrick first rode up the one that had given her the split palm, the one she'd wrapped in cloth, and kept swinging. She hung it on the inside wall of the cabin above the work table. Not as a monument to suffering, not as proof of anything, just as the thing it was, the tool she'd been holding when the work was hardest. And when a person had appeared unexpectedly and picked up the other one and asked nothing in return. She'd learned something in the building. Not the lesson she'd expected. She'd expected to learn that she could do it alone, and she had learned that, but that wasn't the deepest thing. The deepest thing was harder to hold. Strength isn't the same as solitude. She'd confused them. In the years when solitude was the only version of strength available to her, when needing nothing from anyone was the only way to stay intact inside a house that wanted her smaller. She'd carried that confusion into October and into the winter, and it had served her. It had kept her hands moving when her body wanted to stop. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that the cabin stood, and the crop was growing, and her daughter was alive and healthy, and a man had bought the land next door and was fixing a fence and learning about loam, and people had shown up in that council room to say her name with confidence, and none of it had happened in isolation. She'd built the foundation. They'd built the rest with her. Accepting a hand freely given isn't weakness. It's just harder than refusing one, because refusal requires only stubbornness, and acceptance requires trust. And trust is the thing that's hardest to rebuild when someone has spent years teaching you that it leads only to being held. She had rebuilt it, badly, imperfectly, one small increment at a time, the way you build anything in ground that isn't level. That was enough. That was, she thought, sitting on the porch in the August evening with her daughter on her arm, and the field turning gold in the low sun, exactly enough.